Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being on the call. It's John. I'm here in the committee board offices, along with Cynthia Villa from UTEP is also with us, and then Paul and Susan and Tom Keaton from the coordinating board staff. We're trying out this new technology this time, so we'll see how that works out. It's not always easy doing a conference call with this large a group. We'll try to work through that. We do have a meeting scheduled for March 13th, which I think just everybody, maybe one member, was the only one that could not be there. I think the call today is to just kind of lay out where we are, see if how we'd like to proceed from here. But March 13th would be the date at which, if I make any kind of final recommendations, we could go at that meeting. We will discuss some here that would require additional work beyond March 13th, and talk about that. And we don't necessarily make a decision on that today, but at least the conversation. If you're with me, first of all, I think we don't need to take roll because Paul has everybody's name. Is there anything about the technology you want to tell the group?
The only thing I would advise, if you feel like you can't get your turn in talking, the software that you're using has a way to raise your hand. We have somebody looking to check for that, and we'll let the chair know if you raise your hand, and you'll get a turn to speak.
Anybody questions about just the technology? All right. I postpone adopting the minutes till our March 13th meeting. We can just do it at that time. What I'd like to do is just back up a little bit since our January meeting got canceled. We're going into that meeting and what's happened since that time as about to you and what we may discuss today. January, if you recall, we sent a group of models to you that really the purpose was to isolate some of the metrics in our model a little bit more for everybody to look at. A way for me to try to find out exactly how important some of the metrics were. The basic model of just 5 metrics that was sent out, and that would be sort of an outcomes model in its simplest form, metrics that are easy to explain. The intent to say this is the best model, this is how we should proceed, it was really just to try everybody to focus on what they felt was important to the model and go with that January meeting with hopefully ready to make some decisions regarding some of those metrics. We did feedback from a little bit over half the members on, and the consensus clearly was to have more metrics rather than fewer. As a result, the model that you were sent last Friday, which now option 21, I believe, in Paul's work, reflect that the input that we received, back in the metrics that we'd had in clear, everything except critical fields. And from the discussions that we've had in the last couple of meetings, I think the feeling was that critical field a bit different in terms of how outcomes is generally viewed. That might be a policy decision that the legislature might choose to make at some point in time by choosing to add it to a model, but we felt at this point in time better to proceed with that particular metric. There are metrics, however, were put back in: total degrees, degrees per 100 FTSC, and the weighted degrees on input from members. And certainly questions about why certain metrics are in or out. I'm sure there's some people on the phone who wanted these things back in as well, and we can they chime in as well. The other that was done with the model prior to the January meeting was scale that model currently and sort of equalize scaling that we've been using for. And I know there have been some questions about that. So I'll just tell you what my thinking was as we did that. Looking at the model, the two, what I see is sort of the two counterbalancing mechanisms in this model are degree 6-year graduation rates and at-risk degrees. And just policy standpoint, those are kind of the two competing factors. You've got some institutions that have higher admission standards and students, obviously, that have a greater chance of graduating. Other institutions are admitting a much broader set of students captured in the at-risk metric. So the scaling was really based upon balancing those two in particular and using other metrics as a way to balance things as much as possible. And right now, with option 21, I'm fine with all these metrics. I think the cost metric is one that I'm not as enamored with as I was 2 years ago. I think 2 years ago when we added that, it was a good addition to the model and smoothing out some things. For what reason, it doesn't seem to be having the same effect this time as it may be because of updated data, I'm not sure, but moving the numbers a whole lot, and the institutions that benefit from that actually benefit from some of the other metrics. So whether or not is of consequence to me, but there are people, I think, that did like the idea of having it in there. On that, of course, the other we have been discussing is how these would be weighted by institution. We talked about that by accountability group, and by institution do it on their own. And as we've talked about that with the coordinating staff, is that the easiest way to get to that would have each institution with themselves. That'd be done through a process once we're done with this, with some recommendations. Each institution would basically work with the coordinating board staff on that. Now, that will have the effect of moving some numbers around, and so it will require some follow-up work with everyone to kind of do what the results look like. But I think our general feeling is based upon the way Paul has modeled this, where he's tried to optimize the weighting by institution. We don't think there would be a radical movement of numbers. A process we would have to follow up on and work with the coordinating staff through the next several months before we got it right. Where we were in January, and option 21 is a reflection of the input since that, before then, and since that time. And that's probably a good kind of stop and have some discussion about that particular model. Keep in mind that our recommendations already include recommendations to make this a separate formula, relation that the INO formula be fully funded first before future funds the outcomes model. I do think it's important. We can include this in the recommendations. It should be evident, but I think based on some discussions, it's not always evident that this is an evolutionary process. We can't expect to recommend a model or have the committee board recommend a model to the legislature that's going to the final outcomes-based funding. If you look at the history of the Formative Advisory Committee itself, it took a long time to really get the kind of support we have for the INO model that we have. Even just 10 years ago, there were a lot of institutions that still felt like the INO model was not fair. That was a common theme in the legislature from session also. But over time, for a reason, I think to become much more comfortable with that, a lot to do with the alternative, the unknown of the alternative. Nevertheless, there's much more buy-in and support for the INO model now than there was in the past. I think we would view this model in much the same way. It's going to take time. There will be tweaks to that model. 2 year, I expect, from the Formative Advisory Committee. The legislature, of course, may choose to do some things on their own as well. It would take some time to really get this model at a point that we'd have really broad buy-in to it. Let me just kind of open it up and get your feedback on Op 21 and any part of that discussion you'd like to comment on.
Well, part of the city, I was at the coordinating board offices. The way the fund redistributed through option 21, it seems to me that it factors seems to reward similar characteristics of an institution. So, your graduation rate, the retention metrics, and so forth. If you look over on the redistribution, there's a lot of schools losing a significant amount of money to the benefit of what appears to me to be UT, A&M, and UT. And I'm sure that that's either doing what we want it to do, or to the possibility that this is going to gain support in the higher ed community. And I think it's, my perspective, what I know is the UT system, and every single one of the schools in the UT system will lose money on this option, on this scenario option. UT Austin will gain $2.4 million. So that's a real concern to me, because I think it's skewing towards the traditional institutions that have a additional population.
I think that's a good question, and you know, with this 2 years ago as well, for that had the chance to really work through the model numbers in depth, and I know a few have. One of the difficulties here, if you start with just total degrees, I&O, and there's a legitimate question of whether we should be comparing this to I&O funding to begin with, but I think it's fairly from the standpoint of, if you're trying to sell the legislature, they don't want to see a big distribution of funding right off the bat. And if you look at what Tennessee did, Tennessee went to great pains to try to make sure there was not a big redistribution at the outset either. Nevertheless, so looking at it that way, the effect of looking at degrees distribute a large amount of funds to UT and UNT in particular. It seems to be related to the fact that whatever reason we're not doing as well under the I&O formula as institutions are doing right now. But the factors, I know, last time BJ and I had a conversation about this, the fact that we're including undergraduate hours, for instance, probably has some effect on this, particularly a institution like UT Austin, which has a large number of graduate students. There's a number of different factors related to the internal operations of a university looking at these numbers, but the bottom line, if you're looking at degrees, regardless of how you posit, there's some immediate to those institutions of such large amounts, everybody else a loser when you're compared to the I. Now, you should notice, I guess, that Paul's added a couple of columns there at the end regarding funding per degree and funding per FTSC, and this was an effort to find a way to compare this other than just looking at I&O. Work with a lot of different ways. If you know, there was a way to limit the distribution, and actually I think this does, to compare what we were before. I think last model that Paul did before our December meeting, the model we were working off at that time, the institutions that required set-asides was something on the order of 7 or 8 institutions. That's only one, and as a result of really trying to massage numbers in such a way to limit the amount of redistribution. I get it to 0, obviously, unless you just have an I model. But that's, you know, one of the things that everybody has to get comfortable with, that at least in terms of comparing to I&O, there are going to be winners and losers. The important thing, I think, is that we have metrics that we feel we have some control over and can respond to. And I think we've done a pretty good job with that. There's, you know, a lot of teachers aren't going to be able to control per 100 FTSC metric, but that's more a balancing mechanism for some very small institutions. The cost-weighted is tying it back to INO, and again, I'm not on that one as I was before, but I think there are some people that on the committee that like having it in there. So again, there are ways we can scale and weight this. I tell you, just in terms of the way I've worked with it, it's difficult to get it much better than what we already have it, if you're in terms of comparing it to INO. And I don't know what other metrics we could add that would smooth the process out. We could, I suppose, cap the amount of money that an institution could receive, which uses some of that redistribution effect, makes it easier. But other than that, I haven't really come up with any good ideas on that. But anybody else to jump in on this and let us know what you think.
John, this is BJ. I would just kind of echo what you've said about cost-weighted. I mean, putting the cost-weighted column in there, or metric in there previously was kind of to provide some of this specificity that people are trying to, that some of the members have brought forward. And so I think if you're going to provide another means to do that, cost-weighted column loses its effectiveness coming in the equation.
Well, we can have Paul send out, without the cost weighted in there, everybody can look at that. It will smooth out a little bit, not a lot, but it will help with some institutions. Your comments on an issue?
Just coming out loud here, it seems that a lot of the schools that, well, I may be wrong, I'm going to just throw it out there. In looking at it, it seems like a lot of the institutions that have the more non-traditional, looking like UH, some of the border schools, they get the curve with this option 21, and maybe weightings, the weight need to change. Maybe at-risk degrees need to change, because that's where they're, those populations are at. They have heavy at-risk populations. Maybe just tweak of the weight. I don't know. Just a suggestion.
I think that's kind of where we ended up last time, 2 years ago, is that at the end of the process, we really weren't sure what the appropriate weight for at-risk is. In one of the earlier models, at-risk was weighted higher. Some of the feedback that I got was that it was driving the most money in the model. And there was a question as to whether that was really a way to do it. And I don't know the answer to that. This is one of those issues that I think is why you follow it over time to try to get it right. What I'm doing was I wanted to balance out the total amount of money being driven in the model by at-risk versus degrees adjusted by a 6-year graduation rate and the cost-weighted factor. And two means of metrics are both driving about $80 million in the model. So I thought that was a reasonable starting place to sort of equalize those two. Now, whether it should be higher or not is a policy question answer. The other thing is, as you know, there's a lot of interplay between these metrics. So if you're benefiting from at-risk degrees, you're probably also benefiting more so from the 3-hour metric. Likewise, benefiting from the 6-year graduation rate, you're probably benefiting from the 90-hour metric. But exceptions to that, there's some instances that I just know enough about the internal operations of them. UT Dallas is a good example. As well for 6-year graduation rate, which you would expect, it doesn't do as well under the 90-hour metric. And I understand exactly what the reason is, because they're kind of an exception in that respect.
Large transfer population.
Those kind of aberrations to the interplay of these metrics. But again, those are good reasons to stay on top of this and watch it closely to see how it develops. The thing is, what we're trying to do is provide an incentive to focus on To the extent that we can do that, and they have control over these metrics, be successful with that. Now, there's an allocation model like the current IO, and that leaves these redistributions. But with the legislature, I'm not an alternative to that, other than the one that I'll talk about here in a few minutes with Paul Short. We've had some discussions about an alternative to this, but at any rate, any other thoughts or questions about option 21?
This is Mark Migliazzo.
Yeah, Mark.
You know, I think and you've said it well, and others have said it well, I think the inevitability of using this model is we're going to see what we're seeing. And the other part of that inevitability is we're going to get the same kinds of responses we've typically gotten when we see this amount of redistribution of funds moving around. I know when, and this certainly is a lot smoother than the SHART models that we sent out previously, but a lot of very, very adverse response to those, and primarily for the reasons that we discussed. And I think unless there is some other alternative for us to look at, there may not be. We're gonna end up facing this regardless of how we end up tweaking these numbers.
And on that, I mean, this is, in my view, staff may disagree with me. In my view, this is kind of an ordinary charge to us, to this Formula Advisory Committee. We're charged with developing a new model. We don't have to make a recommendation on this. The committee is obligated to make a recommendation to the legislature on outcomes-based funding. Regardless of what we do, he will follow that charge to him, and the board adopts something and send it on to the legislature. Obviously, I took this up 2 years ago with the idea that we'd rather have input in that, and I know that the committee obviously would like for us to have as much support for a proposal as possible, and then he will have to make a judgment on that going forward. So I guess Mark's comments, this is the best model. I think we can all model for various reasons, but down to an alternative. And there may be an alternative that we can think about, but I really kind of exhaust our discussion here on option 21 before we get to that. So is there any other questions or comments?
I suggest maybe we just look at the tweaking of the weights. I've attended, even during the last round to go, that if you're benefiting from the 6 graduation rate, you're benefiting from 30, 60, and 90-hour retention metrics. So that I think sometimes you see that reallocation to some of the UNTs, the Austins. That's my opinion. So I suggest maybe looking at tweaking those particular weights and seeing what achieves.
And we can do that. I mean, I've got some on computer I can send out, pretty quickly because I've been looking at the same things. But we could.
The option of the universities being able to deal with their particular circumstances intended to tweak the weights too?
Yes, that option 21 does anticipate that each institution will have the opportunity to weight these metrics. Now, that's done within certain parameters that obviously we would need to agree upon. If you get option 21 on, if you print, it would be on page 3. There's a box that Paul has there. It's right below the box on the rank of total average scale points per institution, and it just has numbers 1 through 9 with the total at 100%. boxes represent the per metric, it's essentially allowed, the parameters for this particular model. And then Paul has it set up so that each institution essentially has maximized the points by assigning the 25% to their top metric that you get points off of. Now, you can actually look at this a little bit differently, and if you have the opportunity to set these weights yourselves, you may do it a little bit differently, and it may not lead to an increase in funding depending on what everybody else is doing, since it's an allocation model. One thing I will point out that's different about this model is that first 9 metrics, we only have 8 now because we've dropped critical fields. I put a total of 0 for your number 8 metric, give you the opportunity to drop one of the metrics. If there's one metric that you feel like you're simply going to do well in, or you don't want to focus on for whatever reason, you don't have to weight that. That can be weighted at 0. We may not do that. That's an option I thought we'd had some conversation about, and that's contemplated in this model. Be assigned differently. I think most institutions are going to want to have some weights weighted higher than others. Experience Tennessee, because they did the same thing, and if you get to a point where you're allowed to weigh a metric too high, like 50%, 60%, or something like that, you end up with very skewed results, and the distributions tend to get greater. So, again, there's an effort to try to find some kind of balance there, but that's something that we can look at. No other questions on 21. What I'd do is to talk about initiative that in January, and then I've had a couple conversations with Paul Short about this. The idea would be, instead of using an allocation model like we have, it would be to allow each institution to develop its own internal outcomes-based funding model. It would all be for distributing funds within the institution. The University of Houston is doing something like this now. Texas Tech is doing something like that. There may be many of us that are doing something like this, where you establish a kind of priority funding for the university, and some amount of funds of your current funding set aside to be redistributed based on the priorities institution or a methodology. So theoretically, each institution could do this for outcomes purposes. Would need to have a process where there was some oversight over the metrics, so you couldn't just choose any metric. That would have to be negotiated. The coordinating board staff obviously would play a big role in all this. So theoretically, we could do that, and then it just becomes a question of the legislature allocating funding to institutions distributed internally based upon some outcome metrics. There are complications to this, and I haven't read that, so I can't say that this is a viable option at this time. Although, again, I think it's like something that could be put together, would require a lot of work. Work than we've been contemplating, probably. The appropriation mechanism, for instance, would have to be resolved. Access would have to be put in place. Coordinating board to work with each of the institutions on the internal metrics. As a key, we would have to decide exactly how we want to proceed on this. Whether this is a committee to do that or not is questionable. Things done by the community colleges in the adoption of their model, where they essentially assigned another group to those kinds of details, and that would be the better option here as well. let me just ask Paula to jump in, because I know she's interested in this approach. And Paula, and she.
Let's see. Hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, this is very attractive because it moves away from the redistributive model that impacts a lot of these institutions and all of these options, and it really gives the institution a chance to use an outcomes-based model in place that does drive performance. We already do this with our colleges in terms of performance measures that tie to our university goals of student success and national prominence and competitiveness. So being able to do it the way that has been described actually allows the actions of the university to align with its goals and its objectives it set as an institution, which would vary from institution to institution. We go back a certain percentage of the funding, and then our colleges, based on their performance on an annual basis, earn those dollars back based on meeting certain outcomes. It's more. I think it's much more motivating than one that how hard you try, you're still lose dollars. There's nothing that's real motivating about that. There's just some psychology in this that really is attractive. I do believe that it still meets the letter and the spirit of the coordinating board's desire to see institutions meet their complete agenda, but also it really could be a model nationally. I don't know that there's a model out there on the national scene that is based on this particular methodology. So I realize it's got a lot of issues to solve, but I think it would be attractive to most institutions because in the end, they really get an opportunity to see very substantial benefit to putting their energy behind meeting these outcomes and not work hard on these outcomes and then still suffer from the competition with other institutions. The competition becomes internal rather than competition against other institutions. And I just think that would be an incredible step forward for Texas to take, and I know it would help us to motivate and to support our efforts to improve as an institution, particularly in the student success agenda that we have. I don't know if that's helpful. That's part of the conversation we had, and part of the reason that I'm very pleased that an option or another Plan B has been introduced into this, because I do think it has great potential to really benefit the universities and in the state, but in a way that doesn't pit them against
Some questions about that among the members?
And this is Rod. Just very briefly, how that might work. Are you thinking about a set-aside coordinating board where they dole out?
I mean, one of the there's another fund program that I think of that was done sort of this, and the money was appropriated to the particular agency involved to allocate the money, once each entity had developed their internal metrics and everything had been approved. So there'll have to be some kind of approval process involved. It can involve the coordinating board. The legislature might want to say in that and have the LBB do it. I don't know. I mean, you'd have to have some kind of process to approve the plan. The initial allocation is, I think, could be pretty straightforward because it could be based upon the amount of money that you would get to the INO. The question is, how are the allocations? How do they work going forward? Because the idea is you're supposed to be rewarding for success. So those kinds of issues would have to be worked through well. That's about as far as I've gotten with sort of thinking this through.
Thank
John, I think, excuse me.
I just want to add one thing. This is, I know, in conversations we've had, our chancellor has had with Commissioner and some of you there, that last year the idea was those dollars would remain at the coordinating board, and the coordinating board would have oversight in the distribution to campuses. Of course, the next question is, if you're not successful in earning all those dollars that have been set aside for you, what happens to those dollars? So that's a question that we've been asking, and I don't know. It could be used coordinating board to support other initiatives. That's one thing our chancellor talked about. So I mean, that's a sticky point that would have to be figured out too.
This is Perry Moore. If we're talking about 10, is it 10% of the formula?
Undergraduate for.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about everything we've talked about up to this point has been an end to the formula.
I understand that, but of course our great fear is that it might not be that. I don't particularly see giving percent or adding to even 10% plus would be a particularly attractive one in the legislature for the coordinating board to dispense, given what the mood of the legislature was the last time.
That's a really nice way of saying that, Jerry.
Well, I mean, I'm saying it like it was.
I agree.
The legislature, they wouldn't necessarily have to appropriate the money to the coordinating board. They could hold it and have the LBB distributed. I mean, there's other ways to do it. I don't know if any of them are good, but there are other ways to do it.
Each institution
John,
has performance measures that they report to the LBB.
John, I think one of the, as I'm sitting and listening to this, two problems pop into my mind. Number one is have all of our institutions probably doing this in a somewhat different way, which may or may not be something the legislature would be very fond of, even though they did consistently raise the issue of institutional mission in this last session. The other thing is we're kind of going back, it seems to me, back to 2 years ago where we started, when we were talking about setting aside an amount of money and then earning it back. And obviously I'm game to go in any direction that might help us put the best possible model together. But I think it's going to be extremely complicated. I think there'll be a lot of inconsistency with it. And may end up where here, even though I agree with Perry, we don't know whether we'd get a set aside or not, but at least that's our intention with what we're working on here. Let me just throw into this pot, John, and I've mentioned this to you before, and maybe Susan or Paul or somebody from the coordinating board could comment on it. And I don't mean to speak for the commissioner at all, but the last time I heard him make a presentation before the presidents and chancellors talked about this process that we were going through, and he he expressed an expectation that somewhere or another we were going to come up with a plan that might move away from our competing with one another to simply looking at a comparison of our own institution with our own data and whether we're moving forward or not. He also mentioned, as we have sort of touched on, the possibility that there might be multiple metrics, some of which all of us would need to apply, some of which we select depending on the mission of the institution. And the final thing he commented on was something we have talked a bit about, and that is the institution's weighting the individual metrics themselves. And exactly what a model like that would look like, but the thing that struck me is I know he ultimately is going to have to make a recommendation going forward. He seems to have a very different picture of this process than we've been drawing.
Well, I talked to him a little bit about the allowing each institution to select their weights and that sort of thing. And, you know, having a weight of 0 kind of lets you opt out of metrics and weight the others higher, that sort of thing. So all of that kind of fits together. That may be where he was talking about. As far as,
he also talked about this, David Gardner. He also talked about with us the ability of institutions selecting their own measures within a prescribed list of measures, not independently developing new measures, but a group of measures that the committee would recommend, and that everybody would be able to select. So that's essentially what he was. When I've talked to him, and frankly, what he mentioned when we were at US about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So, but he's waiting for you guys to make recommendations. He's just trying to put some more options on the table, having heard the things you said, not trying to prescribe, but trying to alert you that we've got, he's got openness to creations if you guys would choose any of those things. But to hear what you guys recommend.
Yeah, well, I think we were getting very close to that, John, when you were talking about, and David just mentioned it again, and Susan, the opportunity there to move those percentages around or even drop one of the metrics out. That seemed to be where his thinking was, at least when he made that presentation that I referred to. But you just throw that in the mix as we look at these other issues, and obviously coordinating board staff are a whole lot closer to him and to his thoughts and thinking about this than I was simply as an observer when he was making that presentation.
And again, I want to just mention that he also is trying to give you some not as his preference, but as something that consider to know that those would not be things he would give. Oh, you guys welcome them. He wasn't trying to prescribe that. I think there would be some other things that you might discuss that would be fine too.
and I'll reference back to one of the things John talked about earlier. The board did work with the Community College Association. We did an allocation in the 14-15 biennium, and then we got a model that we've worked with the association and all the community colleges on, that moving forward, how to fund where an institution competes against themselves. Don't compete against everybody for those funds. And we model going forward that hopefully will be adopted and everybody's in agreement on.
Now, I want to emphasize the model that's going forward is one they actually came up with, and I was there and helped with them, but it was actually their proposal, and we saw it as a really strong proposal that they developed that we probably wouldn't have proposed ourselves.
So we're saying kind of step process. You do one thing one biennium, and then the next biennium. to compete against yourself. It's just the initial allocation is done a certain way.
How do you do that? How do you achieve that? By setting targets based upon what you achieved the prior?
It was actually clearer than that. They stuck with the rate that the points ended at that initial biennium. So I believe it was $185 a point. They just kept that dollar amount. So as the institutions generated more points, they got more money.
If it's less points, they get a little less money
Appropriation determined.
By that dollar amount.
by that dollar amount, and then they are allowing the 90% to fluctuate. As long as it continues to go by the total increase in the number of points, then everything will be fine. Otherwise, they're allowing the 90% to fluctuate. That 90-10 split will fluctuate, or there's the option that it will fluctuate.
So there, of course, is an add-on. It truly is a carve-out.
It's a carve-out.
There's a carve-out, but it could be done as an add-on as well. The option of making it to where you can compete against yourself, but not against the other institutions.
Which as an add-on of the same amount, what you do is as everybody increases, you take your proportionate share out.
Everybody's in agreement on what determines the points.
Yeah, they reached agreement for the 14-15 on how those points were determined.
Without getting into all the details on it, the points are driven by things like the metrics we've been talking about?
Driven by completion of DevEd, because that's a big portion of what they do. Completion of that first college level course, and then completing 15 hours, 3 hours, receiving certificate, associate degree, or transferring to a university. And they group critical fields, very small bump.
So is the starting point the total universe of points that exist currently, and then moving forward, if you get more points, you get more dollars, and if you lose points, you lose dollars.
Right.
But everything is started off on at a given point as to a snapshot of where everybody is.
It was a 3-year average, and it was how the original dollars were allocated in the 14-15 biennium. Total, that 10% of their funding, they have core values, and then they have not the INO. 10% was based on what was success points agreed upon up front, and 90% was based on their cost study. So from this point on, it came out to each point was worth basically $185. So over your number of points goes up, then you will get, 185 times however many of your points, and if your points go down, you still get $185 per point, but you're having fewer points, and so your amount that will go down.
Well, a way to start at even a level playing field, everybody's starting at the same point, and so any improvement or lack of improvement is then determined by the institutions.
Right.
That it does sound like the discussion of the alternative that John and Paula have been suggesting, from the things that the commissioner is talking about and the things that the community colleges are doing. All of these things do seem to be moving in a similar direction. You're really competing against yourself, and the devil is in the detail, as usual.
Always.
Well, academics had similar discussions years ago, and then going back to the performance incentive funding 5 years ago, we had these same discussions, and problem is that among general academics, the variation in mission and, the look of each institution is quite a bit different than in the community colleges. So it's a bigger problem to do this. Some institutions have much more potential for growth than other institutions, for instance. We have that in our I&O model as well. So you have to get comfortable with that or figure out a way to balance some of that. As among the general academics, it will be a trickier proposition. Any other questions regarding an alternative to option 21?
Well, I think John, the issue is this alternative scenario. There seems to me what the committee is either in a position of A, giving no recommendation, which is a statement by the committee to the commissioner and to the legislature. B, going with options where there's still a lot of redistribution going on, even if you mute it down by bringing in the whole body of the I&O formula, so it's, within a certain range. Or 3, moving towards this alternative possibilities, which seem to me there's more conversation going on outside the committee that sort of pointing at a direction that some of the problems that we have with models like 21 would be addressed. So personally think that the alternative piece is a better way to go.
Well, suggest we have this meeting on March 13th when we've decide how to proceed on this. What I would recommend is that we go forward with option 21 at this time. We'll get some of that out based upon the discussion today and look at that model. Interested in this alternative approach, you need to give some thought to it. You need to start coming up with some concrete recommendations on how we proceed on this. If it really needs to be done by a group in the Formative Advisory Committee, this committee, that's fine. We need to figure out what kind of people it is that need to be involved in that. But I think on March 13th, we need to have something a little bit more concrete on how we would proceed down the road. In the meantime, I think we keep option 21 in play because once we dig into this alternative, we may find it's a full effort, but there is an appeal to it, obviously, and I think it's certainly worth taking a longer look at.
John?
Yes.
Perry, when do we provide a recommendation?
Session would be
John will be in front of the board committee March 24th, 26th. And
Last week of March.
last week of March. So whatever that Wednesday is. So I would think he would like to have a recommendation that go forward to our committee with saying, okay, this is the level of funding, which you'll have voted on, that, you want the outcome space to be over and above and that sort of thing, but that y'all are still continuing to work on models, or, that's fine. But I'm guessing John would really like to have this done with.
That's a fair statement.
I think option 21 can be made more palatable if it's, what we discussed earlier, David, where you have a little bit of control at the institutions, maybe some parameters within which you can either weight or pick or drop a metric, or, just kind of what you described. I think that would make it far more palatable for everyone.
On that, the wishes, Paul, keep one set away.
Start.
So what we're talking about is the design. The design would be your institution would pick the one of those metrics. And the ones that are presented there are just placeholders for now, for presentation purposes. So,
Just for my, I had all of the options that we had intended to look at when we had to cancel the meeting on the 24th, I guess it was, and in my mind, option 12 looked pretty good as well. It's redistributed, but it wasn't as severe.
Okay, I'll look at that one, yeah. I think in terms of recommendations, on the 13th, one option would be to go ahead and go with Model 21 as our recommendation for in 17, or however you might want to phrase that. But a recommendation that we continue to look at alternative to that, that'll each institution more flexibility.
John, I think that would carry a lot of weight if we are able in 21 or something like 21 to make some of these adjustments we keep talking about. Flexibility of dropping a metric, the flexibility of putting the institution's percentages in place within which I think will have to be a very tight range. Flexibility there, but at least we could show that we are beginning to move in the other direction, and maybe at another time we can get there.
Is there any work been done to consider what the range would be?
And remember is that Tennessee's ranges are pretty tight and very well defined on how much movement can be made in these categories. But I don't have that in front of me, so I don't know exactly what they used.
I was putting this together.
They were tight because if you have some of the schools just simply maximize their income, which is what I presume everybody will do, this one, another one will drop that one, and redistribution will be dramatic.
Yeah.
To a lot of that, my recommendation is that you use this list of weights, and that institutions would be allowed to put the weights on whichever metric they want, but they'd only be able to use the weight once, and that way you could avoid mass redistribution or a complicated capping scenario on the weights.
And send out, more explicit directions on that, because I think
That would be good to do because I think it would help us run models.
Right. Yeah. So between now and March 13th, and we have some additional variations of time for everybody to look at. It'll be important to get back to Paul on that so we can be prepared on the 13th. Kind of making on Model 21, we want to go with that. And then as the alternative goes, again, let's set as sort of a longer-term effort. It's going to take a lot of work. Each of you, particularly those that are most interested in this, to spend some time thinking this through, and to the extent you can put something in writing, the better. We have something more concrete we can work with. Have something to distribute to members before the 13th meeting. We can be prepared to discuss all that. Everybody? Anything else anybody wants to add to that? Okay, that's the way we'll proceed then. Paul, anything else we need to?
Nope, I covered.
Unless somebody else has comments they wish to make, then I think we're done for today. I appreciate you all being on the and we'll try for March 13th.
Thanks.
Okay, have a good day.
Bye.
John.